음.
Recording in progress.
조슈아 선생님 안녕하세요. 선생님 들어오셨는데. 안녕하세요. 학교에 계시는 네, 안녕하세요. 선생님 오늘 그 PPT 영상이랑 혹시 뭐 동영상 아니면 이런 것들 한번 시연을 연습을 한번 해 주시겠어요?
PPT를 사용하지 않을 거예요.
아, PPT 사용 안 하신다고요?
예.
아, 그러면 뭐 영상이라든지 이런 거 전혀 사용을 안 하시는 거세요?
예, 맞습니다.
네, 알겠습니다. 선생님 그러면 연습이 필요 없겠네요. 오늘 잘 부탁드립니다. 오늘이 세션 B의 첫 시작이 되는 날이라 앞에 그 KF의 이제 인사말 영상이 처음에 조금 나갑니다. 예, 그것만 끝나면 이제 제가 선생님 소개해드리고 강의를 시작을 해주시면 될 것 같고요. 총 90분 8시 반에 끝나면 되는데 이제 보통 학생들 질문까지 합해서 8시 반에 끝내주시면 되세요.
그래서 제가 얼마 동안 강의해야 되나요?
네, 그래서 이제 뭐 60분에서 70분 정도 해주셔도 되고요. 만약에 이제 제가 미리 질문을 받을 수도 있는데 질문이 많지 않으면 질문은 채팅창에 올라옵니다.
알겠습니다.
그래서 채팅창에 만약에 질문이 없다라고 하면 선생님이 조금 더 이제 길게 말씀을 해주셔도 되는 거죠.
오케이.
네, 감사합니다.
네.
Recording. Morning.
여러분 안녕하세요. 7시가 되었습니다. 만나서 반갑습니다. 저는 이번에 2021년 KF 코리아 워크숍을 진행을 하고 있는 계명대 한미애 교수라고 합니다. 만나서 반갑습니다. 이 늦은 시간에 황금 같은 금요일에 여러분들께서 아주 한국을 사랑하는 마음으로 이렇게 많은 분들이 강의에 들어오셔서 너무나도 감사드리고 또 지금 A 세션은 지난주에 끝났고요. B 세션 오늘 첫 시간인데 모르겠어요. 채팅창이 활발하네요. A 세션은 참가자분들이 굉장히 조용하시고 출석 체크만 하셨는데 우리 B 세션의 참가자분들은 서로 인사도 하시고 그래서 분위기가 좀 더 좋은 것 같습니다. 일단은 오늘 저희가 이전에 보내드린 오리엔테이션 영상은 모두 보셨을 거라고 생각을 하고요. 주관기관인 KF에서 여러분들을 환영하는 메시지를 보내주셨습니다. 그래서 우리 그거 같이 보고 오늘 강의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
All right, are we ready to go?
예, 아니, not yet. 영수 선생님. 잠시만요. 잠시만 기다려 주십시오. 죄송합니다.
잠시만요. 예,
Dear distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2021 KF Korea Workshop. I'm Jung-Gung Ri, Executive Vice President of the Korea Foundation. It's my honor and great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Korea Foundation. The KF Korea Workshop aims to provide participants with a better understanding about different aspects of Korea, including its tradition and heritage, modern transformation, society, and its people. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to each of the participants here who came from more than 44 countries across the world, as well as to our guest speakers whom you will meet throughout the program. Since its launch in 1991, the Korea Foundation has been at the forefront of Korea's international exchanges and public diplomacy. These include people-to-people exchanges in the fields of academia, arts and culture, the media, and policymaking. These exchanges promote friendship and goodwill between Korea and the rest of the world. To promote better understanding of Korea, the KF regularly hosts lectures and workshops for foreign residents in Korea. The KF Korea Workshop was launched in 2015 and represents one of our most important programs to provide participants with in-depth knowledge on current issues in Korea. Although this year, same as last year, unfortunately we are unable to meet in person due to COVID-19, I truly hope the workshop will prove useful for you to deeply understand Korean society. Once again, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to all the participants here today, as well as to our partner organization for this workshop, the KEIMYUNG University. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best.
네, 여러분들 모두 환영한다는 그런 메시지를 보내주셨습니다. 오늘 이 B세션 처음 들어가는 첫 강의로 저희가 첫 A 세션에서는 이제 한국의 안보, 그다음에 6.25 전쟁 이런 거 관련된 안보에 대해서 시작을 했다면 저희 B세션은 한국인이 보는 한국보다는 외국인이 보는 한국, 한국의 역사에 대해서 좀 더 다른 시각으로 여러분들과 아마 공유되는 부분이 많을 거라고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 저희 계명대학교 사학과에 계시는 조슈아 존 선생님께서 우리 한국의 근대사에 대해서 오늘 강의를 진행을 해주시도록 하겠습니다. 강의 중간에라도 혹시라도 이 오늘 강의에 대해서 질문이 있으신 분들은 채팅창에 모두가 볼 수 있도록 질문을 먼저 올려주시면 감사하겠습니다. 조슈아 선생님 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요.
네, 선생님 오늘 좋은 강의 부탁드립니다.
예, 알겠습니다. 최선 다하겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다.
But I'm afraid I will lecture in English.
예, 저는 오늘 영어로 강의를 하도록 하겠습니다. 제가 사실 한국어로 이 전체적인 주제를 다루기에는 영어가 더 편할 것 같아서 영어로 말씀을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 제가 오늘 말씀드리고자 하는 주제는요, 바로 대한민국이
Returned. So oftentimes, we hear about the rise of Korea or the rise of China or the rise of East Asia, and I think that this kind of thinking about recent history in East Asia kind of gives us the sense that maybe a country like Korea has come from nowhere, that Korea has just kind of suddenly appeared without having really come from anywhere at all. And I think for many in the international community, I know certainly I, as an American, I can say that many Americans still, to some degree, have a hard time understanding how Korea could be at this point so prosperous, so successful. And I would say that perhaps for some people, a wealthy and prosperous and international Korea might come as a surprise. But I think actually that it only comes as a surprise perhaps to people who have not really been paying attention. And by paying attention here, I mean people who have not really been paying attention historically. So right now, in the year 2021, we can certainly say that South Korea is firmly in the global mainstream, right? We can think of many ways now in which South Korea is very much a kind of an integral part of the global community. But I would also say that, in this way, we can say that this is something of kind of a return, really, frankly, because also Joseon Korea too. Joseon Korea, meaning the Korean state from 1392 to 1910. That Joseon Korea too was very much in the mainstream of its world. So we might say that perhaps in the short term, that Korea has risen onto the global stage. But if we think in a longer term, I think we can argue that Korea has returned to a position within a global mainstream. So in thinking about the narrative arc of modern Korean history, I would like to think of it maybe perhaps in three parts. One, that in the early modern period, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, that Joseon Korea was very much in the mainstream. It was in kind of, this international or transnational mainstream. But when we get to the period starting from about the 1870s, I would venture to say all the way until the 1980s, it's about 110 years, there is a time in which that mainstream is changing. And it's a time of tremendous disruption for Korea. It's also it's a time of a great deal of physical violence, but also kind of cultural and epistemic violence. So we have about a 100-year period where this mainstream that I'm talking about is changing. And moreover, that Korea is not only adjusting to a new mainstream, but I also would argue that Korea is helping to create a new mainstream. So after the period, say, of the 1970s, 1980s, at least in South Korea, then we come to a time where South Korean economic development really takes off. We have also a very active democracy movement in South Korea and the shedding of the military dictatorships of the 60s and 70s. And perhaps you are aware of the 1988 Olympics, which was kind of a coming out onto the world stage for South Korea. So at that point, then, I think starting in the 1980s and into the 1990s, we begin to see the kind of Korea that we are familiar with today, a Korea that is very present on the world stage, very much in the mainstream of our sort of global community. So we might want to think about modern Korean history as perhaps simultaneously a rise, a new kind of thing, a new set of phenomena, but also a return to the mainstream. I think we can also think about modern Korean history as disjuncture, as a breaking apart, that certainly the Korea of 2021 does not really look like the Korea, say, of 1870. So it's most certainly a disjuncture. But I think it also, if we want to understand why it is that now, in the 21st century, that Korea has such a prominent position on the world stage, there's also some continuity, right? Korea has experience being in the mainstream. It's not the first time. So in that way, there's some continuity with the past. It's a return to a position that Korea has actually had for a very long time. So let's then think about what this mainstream is that I'm talking about in the early modern period. So early modern for Korean history is usually starts at 1600s to the mid 1800s. We can call that early modern. And in that time period, Joseon Korea is part of a transnational community. It's part of maybe what we might call an East Asian cosmopolitanism. So there's an international community, a transnational community that consists of what we would now call China, Korea, Japan, and also Vietnam. In many cases, people talk about Vietnam as being a part of Southeast Asia, but in this talk tonight, I actually want to contain or include Vietnam as part of East Asia. The reason that I think that these four countries, China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, should all be considered to be one, is that they share, for example, a common classical literature and a common set of commentarial traditions on that literature. So by a literature here, what we're talking about is shared like texts like the Book of Odes, a collection of ancient Chinese poetry. We're talking about the Spring and Autumn Annals, which is about also ancient Chinese history. Books on ethics, on morality, on scholarship, on personal self-cultivation. We might in English in general call this term, or this collection of shared classical literatures, we might call it Confucianism. So that China and Korea and Vietnam, Japan, a little bit less perhaps, but still all part of this transnational community. We also have not only we have shared literatures, but there's also a shared classical language. Right, so the classical language that we're talking about, in English we might call it classical Chinese, or we could call it literary Semitic. These are words that we might use for the shared classical language. And it's a language that you might compare perhaps to Latin in Europe. If you think about, for a great deal, perhaps, of medieval history and even into the early modern period in Europe, that the language of scholarship, so the language of refinement, the language of science, was Latin. And so even though you might be French or German or English or Polish or Italian or Spanish, whatever it may be, all of these educated strata of people would have access to Latin and to the texts that are written in Latin. It's the same for classical Chinese. It's kind of the Latin of East Asia. So the educated in China and Korea and Japan and Vietnam were all literate in classical Chinese, which meant that even if they don't share a spoken language, they shared a written language. And actually, we have many records of when Korean envoys, for example, went to China, that they could speak on paper, right, with their Chinese counterparts. And sometimes they met people from Vietnam. And while they can't speak orally, they're able to write to one another in classical Chinese. And the same is true for communications with the Japanese, between Koreans and Japanese, that even though there's no shared spoken language, there is a shared written language, and that is classical Chinese. So there is a transnational community, both of classical literature, and that classical literature, as I mentioned before, it includes philosophy, it includes statecraft, it includes ethics, it includes history. It's a very, very large body of knowledge. All that is shared across these four countries and shared through this common classical language. And I would like to really stress too that some people think about this as like maybe the Koreans or the Vietnamese somehow kind of worship China and worship things that are Chinese, but I don't think of it that way. It's not about people in Korea reading Chinese history because it's Chinese. It's rather they read these kinds of histories and these kinds of texts because they believe that there's something important to be said in them. There's something important to be learned. It's not about being ethnically Chinese or being nationally Chinese. It's about having a body of knowledge that's worth knowing. And this body of knowledge is universal. They are universal principles. Like, Confucianism is not an ethnic set of values, but they're universal values. So if you are Chinese, or if you are Korean, or if you are Japanese, or you're Vietnamese, or actually it doesn't really matter what you are, that the principles that are contained within these texts can apply universally to human experience. So Korea is very much part of that world. And that kind of knowledge, those texts, that language, is the mainstream. That is what constitutes real knowledge. And Korea is right in the middle of that. We might also look at shared institutions, so that the form of government in Joseon, Korea is actually really quite similar to forms of government in states on the Chinese mainland, to Vietnam, maybe a little bit less in Japan, but still, for example, there are 6 ministries in the Joseon government. There's a ministry of finance, there's a ministry of taxation, there's a ministry of rights, there's a ministry of personnel, a minister of public works, a minister of the army, a ministry of punishments. And the organization is very, very similar. So that if we think about standards of how to rule the people and how to create governments, again, Joseon, Korea is part of the mainstream. That the way that governments are structured in East Asia is also the way that governments are structured in Korea. We might also look, for example, at the institution of the censorate in the Joseon state. The censorate is a really interesting office, or a collection of offices that were responsible for criticizing the king. So if the king made an incorrect decision, the censorate could say to the king, "King, you are wrong." Or if there were high-level ministers or officials who were doing something incorrect in the government, the censorate could say, "You have done something wrong." How do we know that a king has done something wrong? You'd think, like, isn't the king the king? But we have, again, this shared body of knowledge, right? We have this shared body of ethics and philosophy, morality, history, literature, that everyone, and by everyone here, I mean China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, all of those people, all of us can draw upon that so that we know what is right and what is wrong. And so that the censorate could say, if the king did something wrong, they can say, we know from this text or that text that what you have done is wrong. And we all agree on that. So you have this, I would say that actually within the Joseon government, it's a very scholarly kind of institution. Because in order to be able to propose policies, to critique policies, to institute policies, you have to know this large shared body of what we might call Confucian knowledge. So it's an erudite culture, it's a highly scholarly culture, and it's a transnational culture. Because it's not just Korea, not just Japan, not just China, not just Vietnam, but it is a transnational, like kind of a universal culture that Joseon is a part of. Now there's a figure who lived in the 17th century. I guess I can use the chat too, can't I? Who I think really embodies this kind of transnational cosmopolitan sort of scholarly ethic. And that is a man by the name of Yu Hyung-won. Yu Hyung-won, he lived in the 17th century from 1622 to 1673. And like many, sort of scions of a wealthy family, he attempted to start an official career in the government as a bureaucrat, because in Joseon, Korea, perhaps the best way to gain political power or financial power or social upward mobility is through becoming a bureaucrat. But frankly, he kind of failed as a bureaucrat. He didn't like the political life. And he retired to the countryside at a rather young age. And instead, he thought about the social and cultural and political problems of Joseon, Korea, and tried to come up with reform programs for how the Joseon government might address, for example, education, or how the Joseon government might address the question of slavery, or how to strengthen the military, or how to increase tax revenue so that the government can act more freely. He considered many of these kinds of social and political, economic, and military problems. And how does he write this? How did he do this? Well, he has it's actually one of the only remaining texts that Yu Hyung-won wrote. But there is a book that he wrote, and it's called Pange Suruk. Pange is Yu Hyung-won's pen name, so that's another name for Yu Hyung-won. And Suruk is kind of a collection of writings, kind of like a collection of random writings. So this Pange Suruk was a collection of Yu Hyung-won's writings on political problems, social problems, economic problems, educational problems, et cetera, in Joseon, Korea. And he had many suggestions for how to fix these problems. Now, how did he come up with these ideas? Well, being trained as a scholar, he was familiar with this large body of knowledge, this kind of large Confucian canon that we've been talking about. And he also, because he was someone who read classical Chinese, it means that he could draw not only upon Korean history and Korean case studies in Joseon, Korea, or if we go back even farther, maybe to Goryeo, or back even farther than perhaps Shinla, he could read all of this material. But it also means that he could read case studies from throughout all of Chinese history as well. And so when Yu Hyung-won was thinking about these problems, thinking about how to solve these problems, he looked at the Zhou dynasty. Zhou dynasty in China is about 3,000 years, 2,500, 3,000 years old. He looked at the Han Dynasty from 200 BC to 200 AD. He looked at the Tang Dynasty, 7th century, 8th century AD. He looked at the Song Dynasty. We're talking there about what, 10th, 11th, 12th century AD. He looked at the Ming Dynasty from the 14th century to the 17th century. So he looked at all these different policies from over a very, very long swath of history, not only of policy history in Korea, but also policy history in all of the old Chinese states on the mainland of Asia as well. And then what I find really interesting about the Pangyesuruk, this collection of writings from Yu Hyung-won, is that not only does he have this really intense and deep engagement with transnational history of the state of Zhou, the state of Han, the state of Tang, the state of Song, the state of Ming, but also he knows about Joseon history and Joseon conditions and Goryeo and Shilla. He knows about all of these things because of his participation in the cosmopolitan culture. And he knows because he's been trained and educated in this cosmopolitan culture. So he simultaneously knows that on the one hand, Korea has its own history and its own issues, its own conditions, but he also knows about Korea within the context, right, of this larger East Asian world. And so I think that when we think about, the kind of Confucian cosmopolitanism of early modern East Asia, and early modern Joseon Korea, I think Yu Hyung-won is a really interesting example of somebody who embodies that. Right? He sort of lives and breathes and eats and drinks this transnational culture. And so it's a transnational culture that, as I'm arguing, Joseon Korea was right in the middle of it, very much a part of it, in the mainstream. Right? So Joseon Korea is in the cultural mainstream of its world in the 1600s, 1700s, even into the 1800s. Here's the thing now, when we get to the middle 19th century, 1860s, 1870s, then we're getting to a point where the mainstream is changing, right? So we might talk about a early modern kind of Confucian cosmopolitan mainstream in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. But as we move through the 1800s, it's kind of like the stream is moving. And Joseon is finding that it needs to rethink its position. Joseon intellectuals, Joseon politicians, Joseon people in general are beginning to realize that world situations are changing. And something new needs to happen because the older systems are no longer really able to deal with new situations that are arising. So if we think about this period from about the 1870s up through, I'm going to say all the way to like the 1980s, right, about 110 years, it is a time of tremendous disruption, tremendous destruction, and a very frankly, very difficult and very painful kind of journey that Korea has to make to find its new place in the new world. And I would venture to say that it's not just a matter of the world changing and Korea having to react to it, but actually in the process of learning what this new world is, Korea is simultaneously making the world as well, making its own situation, making its own sort of new mainstream. Right? So let's take a look at some of the things that happened in this 110-year period. Now, we could write many books on this 110-year period, and naturally, in the amount of time that we have, we can't talk about everything. But I will just give you a very quick overview of some of the really fundamental changes, fundamental challenges that occurred in this approximately 100-year period. So If we start, say, with the 1870s and the 1880s, we have first the collapse of the East Asian interstate system. Now, it used to be that Joseon Korea really had relationships with two countries. That would be China and Japan. And the relationship with China was one of deference. And China, protected Korea. Korea acknowledged Chinese superior strength. And so they had a kind of a cooperative relationship. And then with Japan, that during the 19th century, that Joseon kept a friendly relationship with Japan. So there are two states. But as we get into the 1870s, we have other states that are showing up on the scene. Other states, well, like Russia, for example, that in the 1860s, the Russians acquire what is now the Pacific Maritime Province in Vladivostok, that region. They acquire that through treaty with the Qing Empire, the Chinese Qing Empire, and now they're bordering Korea. And then in the 1870s, the French and the Americans and the Germans launched some minor raids against Korea. And so there's kind of a new world happening where it's no longer just a matter of we Koreans have a relationship with China on the one hand, Japan on the other, but there's a larger kind of world system knocking at the door. And the result eventually is that Korea enters into relationships with many different countries. Not just China, not just Japan, but eventually the United States, the British Empire, France, Germany, Austria, Russians, on and on. So internationally, right, there is this really radical change, because for several hundred years, actually, the Joseon state only had relationships with two countries. Now, how Korea should move forward kind of into this new modern world. There's one group of people within Korea that say, perhaps the best thing we could do is that we can adopt Western technologies, like Western military technologies, transportation technologies, communications technologies, construction technologies. We can adopt the technologies, but we won't change our cultures or institutions, because we want to remain. Perhaps we'll keep our Confucian knowledge. We'll keep that whole long tradition of classical knowledge, but we'll just get some new technology. We'll just have new tech, and then we don't really have to seriously change our society. But there's another group that says, the world is changing so much that half measures are not good enough. It's not going to be good enough just to say, we'll take guns and boats and weapons and telegraphs and things like that, but we won't change. No. What we're going to have to do is have a total revolution. We have to change our government. We have to change our society. We have to change our philosophy. We've got to change everything. So there's a clash, right, 1880s and 1890s in the Korean government between those officials that say, let's be more gradual. And these are people who are generally kind of pro-Chinese. And then others are saying, we have to burn it all down. We have to completely have a revolution. And these people tend to be more pro-Japanese. What this led to during the 1880s was some very serious political violence. 1882, there is a revolt that leads to Chinese military intervention. 1884, there's a coup attempt. That all this eventually leads to about a 10-year period of very, very deep Chinese intervention into Korean affairs. So we also have not only Chinese intervention during the 1880s, but also the British are temporarily occupying some of Korean territory as well. So there's a struggle of trying to how we Koreans, how are we going to be able to deal with a fundamentally different world? Maybe we take a radical route, maybe we take a gradual route. But it was very, very difficult. And as I say, it's not just a matter of people arguing, but sometimes it breaks out into actual violence and foreign intervention. When we get on to the later into the 1890s, we have also 1890s and early 1900s, there are 3 wars that Koreans have to experience. 1894, 1895, the Japanese and Chinese have a war that is fought largely actually on Korean territory. There's the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905, also again fought partially in Chinese territory, partially in Korean territories, the war. There's also an uprising, the Donghak uprising in the 1890s in Korea. So there's a tremendous amount of violence. And the kinds of like sort of psychological and cultural change that we're talking about here, it's not just people sitting around like, thinking about things. But these are changes in thought and changes in culture that have real material, physical consequences. So it's a very, very difficult time. In the period from 1897 to 1910, the Korean government declared that rather than be a kingdom, as it had been for such a long time, that it would become an empire. And so the king of Korea became the emperor of Korea, and they changed the name from the kingdom of Joseon to the empire of the Han. And perhaps you might know Han from the word Hanguk, right? The current name for Korea, Hanguk. That Han was originally used as the Great Han Empire, the Daehan Jaeguk. And why like try to be an empire? I mean, Korea didn't have any territories, didn't have any colonies, didn't have any dependencies. But the idea, though, here is that who's next door? There's the Empire of Japan. There's the Empire of China. There's the Russian Empire. Everybody's an empire. And in the old interstate system, a king, a wang, a king, is someone who receives their title from who? From an emperor. And the idea is that if you keep the title king, maybe you're not really independent, really. So we should call ourselves an empire, and the king should call himself an emperor. So that's a kind of a way, perhaps, for Korea to emerge, right, from the uncertainty of the collapse of the old interstate system, the interventions of all these Western powers and the Americans. Is a way to guarantee Korean independence in a new and very difficult world. But as you may imagine, though, empires have emperors, and an emperor should be an absolute monarch, no, right? You should have, as an emperor, you should really control the government, absolutely. But again, we don't have agreement really among Korean people as to how to move forward on this. So there are some people who say, yes, our new Korean emperor should have more power than any Korean king ever used to have. Remember, we said that the Korean kings were subject to criticism from their government. So let's not do that. We're going to have a real emperor ruling over a real empire. And so, you know what? As the emperor of Korea, I don't want to hear any criticism. I don't want to hear about my being wrong. I'm not wrong, because why? Because I am the emperor. But there were a lot of Koreans already by the 1890s who no longer could accept this kind of authoritarianism, this kind of monarchism. And so there was a big fight in the 1890s about whether the Korean government should be more parliamentarian. So there was a group called the Independence Club that was arguing with the Korean government about creating a parliament. But you have the Korean government who says, no, we're not going to create a parliament. We are actually going to have all power reside within the body of the emperor. So again, if we think about the mainstream is changing, Koreans are trying to find their place within that mainstream, but at the same time, they're also making the mainstream, right? So, but this making, this repositioning and remaking is a very, very difficult process, again, that involves political strife. I would venture to say kind of cultural tension, even like psychological tension, and oftentimes real physical violence, as demonstrated by various uprisings, and within a 10-year period, 3 different wars. You know, the Donghak Uprising, the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War. So as we move into the 20th century, this attempt by the Korean government to create an empire and to sort of strengthen Korean independence through this imperial model eventually fails in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War. Right? The Russians and the Japanese fight a war, the Russians lose, which means actually then that the Japanese kind of win superiority over Korea. And during the period from 1905 to 1910, the Japanese systematically dismantle the Korean government until we get to the point in 1910 where the Japanese annex Korea into the Japanese Empire. So again, another crisis. If we think about from 1910, go back to 1870s, we have 40 years of crisis. How do we deal with the collapse of the old interstate system? How do we deal with reform for a new era? Should we be radical? Should we be gradual? Can we take power through a coup d'etat? Should we take power through a revolution? Should we formulate our government as a parliament? Should we formulate our government as an empire? And finally, all those questions are kind of destroyed when the Japanese annex Korea in 1910. But then we have a whole new set of problems as to what to do about the fact of colonization, of Japanese colonization. Some people collaborated with the Japanese. They thought maybe the Korean government has failed us, so maybe we should try working with the Japanese. Some people said, well, perhaps the reason that the Japanese have succeeded is maybe because Korean culture is inferior. So what we need to do is we need to improve Korean culture, improve Korean people, so that they can be worthy of independence at some time in the future. Other people said, no, we must take up weapons and we must resist the Japanese directly. We must fight them directly. The Japanese army was very, very powerful, so that couldn't really happen in Korea, but there were extensive guerrilla warfare that went on, well, somewhat in Korea, but also in what is now modern day Northeast China, at that time called Manchuria. There were a lot of other people who just tried to survive. I think most people in Korea during the colonial period, still in many ways, Korea is a very poor country at that time. There's a lot of poverty, and most people, I think, they're not thinking about collaboration, they're not thinking about resistance, they're probably really thinking about how can I make sure that I can, that my family will survive, that I will survive this period. But however you look at it, whether you look at people who decided to collaborate and say, okay, I give up on Korea, I will join Japan. Or some people who say, let's rebuild the Korean character. Or other people who say, no, Koreans are good enough as they are, let's fight. And then other people who are saying, I just want to live. I don't want to starve. I don't want to be arrested. I just want to survive. I just want my husband, my wife, my children to survive, my parents to survive. But either way, if we have like those 4 different ways of thinking about how to deal with the colonial reality, we're still thinking about changing circumstances that people in Korea have not known, a world that people in Korea have not known. The world is constantly changing and transforming, and it's crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. So you might think that when we get to 1945, 1945 was the end of World War II, the defeat of Japan. So the Japanese Empire collapses, and on 1945, Korea is liberated from Japanese rule after 35 years. So you might think, okay, well now our problems are over. Now we Koreans are free to participate or to create the space and create the world, create the country that we want to create. But that, of course, was not to happen. There are two sets of problems. One is internal to Korea and the other is external to Korea. If you remember that during the colonial period, some people wanted to collaborate with the Japanese and some people wanted to resist the Japanese. And so in 1945, all of those people were together in one country. So the more conservative people were more closely associated with Japanese colonial rule. And those who were more to the left, the communists, socialists, anarchists, they were the people who were much more concerned about resisting Japanese colonial rule. So all those people are all together in the same place. And they are not happy with each other. So you've got that tension between the right wing and the left wing in 1945. But also, the Americans and the Soviets agreed that when Japan surrendered, that the Russians would occupy the north part of Korea and the Americans would occupy the south part of Korea. And then later, at some unspecified date, there would be elections in the whole country. But that didn't happen, as you well know. So the people who were on the left, the communists and the socialists, they kind of naturally associated themselves with the Russians, and of course the Russians sought them out. And the Americans sought out the conservative groups in Korea. And what ends up happening is that the Russians, along with the leftist Koreans, create a state in the north, which we now call North Korea. And the Americans and the conservative, the rightists in the south, created a state which we now know as South Korea. And within those two states were formed in 1948. And 2 years later, there is an absolutely devastating war, the Korean War, from 1950 until 1953. A war that killed probably around 4 million people, although it's difficult to know exactly. But it was an absolute horrific disaster. And as Korea now is still divided between North and South, with no peace treaty, we are still every day, we live actually with the legacy of that war. But after 1953, at the very least, the shooting stops. So you might think, well, okay, maybe finally now we can have some peace. But we have both North Korea and South Korea are destroyed by war, and it takes a very long time to rebuild. And so there is widespread poverty and suffering and deprivations in both North and South Korea during the 1950s. And it's still, if you think about it, from the 1870s up through the 1950s, it's really been a very, very difficult path. And it's still disorienting, it's still confusing, and the future is still unclear. In my regular courses, and actually two of my students I think are actually here, so they're going to hear this story again. But if you want to imagine what this kind of psychological and cultural dislocation is like, think about it. Back in the 1890s, the civil service examination in Korea was abolished. So it used to be, back in Joseon, Korea, if you wanted to join the government, you had to study and study and study, and you had to take this exam, a very difficult exam, and pass the exam. Now, It's an exam essentially of all the kind of transnational Confucian knowledge that I started talking about at the beginning of this talk. So you need to know all that. How do you know all that? Well, you start off as a child. I guess we all start off as children, right? But you start as a child and you start through group memorization. You memorize all the texts and you learn how to read the classical language. You learn all the commentaries. You memorize all the commentaries. And perhaps by the time you are in your late teens or maybe into your 20s, you might be ready to take the exam. But you might not pass it the first time. And maybe you don't pass the exam until you're in your 30s. Or maybe you don't even pass the exam until you're in your 40s. But it's a lifelong thing from the time you are maybe 6 or 7 years old until you're 20 or 30, maybe even older. That whole time you are studying full time to learn this knowledge to pass that exam. And then in 1895, the government says, no more exam. And then suddenly that exam no longer counts. It means like that knowledge no longer counts, right? That knowledge doesn't count anymore. So let's do a little thought experiment here. And imagine perhaps that when you are a small child, you would like to become a lawyer. And so you begin your education as you go to a nursery school, and you go through kindergarten, and you go through primary school and middle school, you go through high school, you take the university entrance exam, and you enter into an undergraduate university, and then you graduate, and then you take the entrance exam for law school because you want to become a lawyer, right? And you pass and you go to law school, and then you study law at law school, and you graduate with your doctorate in law, and then you are ready to take the bar exam. You're ready to take the last exam to get your license as a lawyer. And then you hear the news. We don't have a bar exam anymore. That's canceled. That's abolished. If you want to become a lawyer now, we have new rules. And the rules are that you have to know all the Confucian classics, and you have to memorize all the legal codes of the Ming Dynasty, because we're going to base law now on the Ming Dynasty. And also, all of those texts are in a language that you don't know. They're all in classical Chinese, so now you need to learn classical Chinese. So go memorize all that material in a language you don't know, and then come back, and then you can take the new law exam, take the new bar exam. Right, so imagine if that happened to you now, where all the knowledge that you thought was knowledge, and all the things that you thought were important are just not important anymore. And you need to do something new. And we're not really sure what that new thing is, but the old knowledge, we're not going to use it anymore. So we go through the 1870s, 1880s, and 90s, and 1900s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and we still are going through this kind of turmoil in Korea of change and crisis, and not really knowing what's going to happen, not really knowing how to make it happen. Now, I'm not going to talk really about North Korea, which is kind of a different story after this point. But in South Korea, we have the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s, we have about almost 30 years of military dictatorship and really very severe political repression. But we have also the rise of a new kind of commercially minded industrializing society. And then through the 1980s, we have a growing democracy movement until finally in 1987, actually mostly university students primarily were able to force the military government to abdicate its position. And it was the beginning of a real democracy in South Korea. And it's also the time really when Korea began, the Korean economic development really began to take off. And so if we think about South Korea from the 1980s and into the 90s and now into the 2000s, we see that much like, I would argue, much like Joseon Korea was very much in the center of its world that now South Korea is very much in the center of a global world, of a global community. If you think about Korean businesses, Korean manufacturing, the Korean tech industries, you think about Korean culture, and I don't mean like traditional culture, and I'm talking about like I mean, do we even have to mention BTS, right? We have Korean music all around the world, K-pop around the world. Korean films are now winning the highest awards all around the world. Korean television programming is becoming commonplace, frankly, right? All around the world. Korean food, you can find it everywhere. I just read that perhaps you're familiar with ramen, and especially Shinramyeon, which I will say is my favorite ramen. Just recently, actually, overseas sales of Shinramyeon are now outpacing domestic sales within Korea. So that Korean dried instant noodles are around the world. And even Korean language. People around the world are studying Korean language, Korean history, Korean culture. And actually, we even right now, right in the introduction, we just heard that there are people from 44 different countries that are participating in these Korea Foundation workshops. People from 44 different countries around the world are interested enough in what Korean culture and society and politics and economics and business, they're interested enough in these things to be able to sit here and say, listen to me talk to you for an hour. So Korea is now very much in a new mainstream. And it's not just that this new mainstream happens to Korea, but I would suggest now that Korea is itself making the mainstream. So if we go back to the first question, is it a rise or is it a return? Do we have a disjuncture or do we have continuity? And I think I would say yes to everything, right? I mean, yes, actually, we can say that Korea has risen, especially after the Korean War. But if you think about it, the last 100, 150 years, Korea has experienced multiple wars, multiple rebellions, coup d'etat, the colonization by Japan, and an absolutely horrible war, the Korean War, terrible poverty in the post-war period, and now at least South Korea is among the wealthiest countries in the world. Absolutely, that's a rise for sure. But I think it's also a return, because Korean people didn't do this based on nothing. Right? If we think about the intellectual foundations and the institutional foundations, Korea has been a cosmopolitan and really kind of a transnational country for a very long time. And so the kinds of institutional frameworks and the intellectual and the scholarly frameworks that you would need to really to build a society like South Korea have been here for a very long time. So in some ways, yes, absolutely, Korea has risen, but I want to say too that Korea has returned. It's not like this is something brand new. And then as for disjuncture, disconnection, sure. The Korea of 2021 is absolutely not the Korea of say 1821 or even the Korea of 1921. The changes actually have been really profound in multiple ways. That really should go without saying. But there is also some continuity. Again, I think that the continuity comes in the kind of intellectual culture of Korea and its institutional cultures. And we could talk about, okay, like I just did, that the kind of Confucian civil service examination was abolished in 1895. But I will tell you that if you go to the bookstore right now, you can find all of the Korean classics. Everyone still reads them, and they keep publishing them, and people keep buying them. So even though that body of kind of transnational knowledge, of Korea and Japan and China and Vietnam, even though we might think about that as something in the past, that's actually still something very much in the present as well. People still study that. People still think that it means something. Maybe you don't need it for the civil service exam, but there's still a kind of scholarly tradition, a contemplative tradition, and a tradition of political participation, and a kind of a tradition of social participation that predates this rise. So to those four questions, is it rise? Is it return? Is it disjuncture? Is it continuity? Yes, I would say yes to all four of those things. And if you want to really kind of understand modern Korean history, by modern Korean history, we say, say from the 1600s until now, so the last 400 years, I would say that the narrative arc of that story is going from a kind of cosmopolitan mainstream to an era of crisis and experimentation and renegotiation, reimagination, and then finally, in the late 20th century, coming out of that process on the other end, now firmly centered in a new kind of mainstream, and not just a mainstream that somebody else made, but it's a mainstream that I think Korea now is actively making, actively shaping on its own. So yes, Korea has navigated, really kind of orchestrated a systemic transformation, right, of its place in the world, but it's all sort of based upon the foundations of Korean history, really, as a state and a society and a people that are steeped in a long history of intellectual and institutional cosmopolitanism. So thank you very much. That is my presentation. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments if you have any. Do we have any thoughts?
Professor, may I ask this question?
지금 목소리 들리세요?
So can you hear me? Can you hear me?
네, 감사합니다. 죄송합니다. 마이크가 꺼져 있는지 몰랐어요.
So I turn off my microphone while saying sorry for that. So the Professor Joshua had talked about the history of the Joseon, and I think that is it true that Korea is in mainstream? And you said that the Joseon was in mainstream. I was a little bit surprised to know that Joseon was in the mainstream. So do you have any question?
There's a question about what is mainstream. So what I mean by mainstream in the early modern period is essentially Confucian cosmopolitan culture. So if we think about in the early modern period, like the 1600s, the 1700s, 1800s, in that time, what is knowledge? What is government? What is philosophy? What is morality? Well, those kinds of questions can be answered, right, in this body of kind of transnational Confucian knowledge, right? So Korea participates in that knowledge, right? The Koreans study that, they know it, they practice it, and that places them really right in what I'm calling here kind of the mainstream. And by mainstream here, we can talk about this as kind of East Asian cosmopolitan culture. So, it's not like China and Korea and Vietnam, I'm sorry, China, Japan, and Vietnam do one thing, and then Korea does some strange other thing. Korea is right there in the middle, intellectually and politically and philosophically. Korea participates in that world. So when I talk about the mainstream, I mean the sort of the larger shared body of knowledge of that world. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
질문 있으신 분들은 직접 그 마이크로
Do you have any
가능하시면
question? So if you have a questions, please turn on your microphone to raise a question, or please write down your questions on the chatting room.
Thank you for an amazing presentation. I have a question about, like, you mentioned that, like, for years, Korea has been trying to find his place in the world, like in the new world. And I just want to hear your opinion. Do you think today's Korea still struggles to find his place in the world, in terms of, like, because, like, he how much does the Korean policies depend on the regional politics and the international politics, and how much does the world politics shape today's Korea's policies?
Well, I think to answer that question, we have to be careful to think differently about North Korea and South Korea. I think that North Korea is especially struggling to define its place in the world. And a great deal of North Korean diplomacy now, not just now, but I would say for the last 40, 30 years or so, has been about really attempting to define and secure its place in the world system. When it comes to South Korea, I mean, I guess we have to think about what do we mean by South Korea? Like, what is that thing? I mean, like, it's not like we can ask South Korea what it thinks about, right? But if we think about people who are involved in kind of the Korean culture industry, we think about people who are involved in the Korean tech industry, we think about people who are involved in Korean economic policy, that these are areas, I think, of South Korean life that are intimately plugged into the world. They're not just in Korea, and it's not even regional. So, Korea, I mean, we know, right, that Korean corporations are active all around the world. We know that Korean culture and Korean products are consumed all around the world. So, and to a certain degree, I suppose any country, right, is maybe not totally independent because they have to depend upon the world system in which they're in, right? But I would say, though, that even though you could argue that South Korea is like, if you're more to the left, you might argue that South Korea is a quasi-colony of the United States, and you might argue that perhaps South Korea is not fully sovereign. But if you look beyond the questions of the military, because that kind of opinion comes from the fact that in the case of an emergency, that command of South Korean military forces passes to the United States. But if you think about all the other sort of aspects of South Korean society and South Korean culture, I think there's a tremendous amount of autonomy. And I think especially now, these days, there are a lot of questions about sort of American hegemony, whether or not the United States is perhaps an empire in decline. And I think increasingly there are a lot of people in South Korea that no longer think about the United States as the absolute pinnacle of achievement. And instead, they're thinking like, well, maybe I don't want to migrate to the United States. Why? I think I like life in Korea better than life in the United States. So there's a kind of confidence and I think greater and greater level of sort of cultural and social independence in Korea. I mean, of course, if there's another massive shift in the regional system, the international system, then who knows what's going to happen? We can never know. But does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you for the answer. Thank you.
So I see there's a question here from Kim Young-soo. What do you think the tradition of revolution in Korea, for example, candlelight protest, I believe that the 6 election such a sensitive in the country of revolution. Yeah, I agree. When I was in middle school, I knew almost nothing about Korea when I was about, say, 11 or 12 years old. But one thing that I did know was demo. I knew that Koreans were good at demonstrations because I saw on the news that there were massive, massive demonstrations in Korea. And that was actually one of the first impressions I had about Korea, was that kind of direct political participation. And, that kind of critical spirit and that kind of direct political participation, I think, has a very long tradition in Korea. It's not just the 20th century. We can find it in the colonial period. We can find it in the 1890s. We think about the Independence Club, protesting against the imperial government. But we can go back farther, 1860s, the Jinju Rebellion. We can go back, we can go way back throughout the Joseon period. We can go back actually to massive slave uprisings in Goryeo and medieval Korea. So there's a very, very long tradition, I think, of protest and, of sometimes revolution, but certainly protest for sure. We might think about a Confucian society as being a repressive society, but it's also a society in which there are mutual obligations. And when mutual obligations are not met, right, those are periods of revolution, those are periods of protest. And I think that a lot of people say that Confucianism makes people passive, makes people loyal. I actually don't think that's the truth. I think that actually that kind of political tradition really encourages, frankly, justice, right? It encourages proper treatment and proper relationships. So absolutely, I agree with you that there is a very long tradition of resistance and rebellion and revolution in Korea that really is a strength of the society as a whole. I absolutely agree. Another question here. I'm going to apologize for not being able to pronounce your name. I'm sorry. Thank you, Professor. What do you think is it possible for reunification of Korean subcultures? So reunification is a really, really tough question. And I think one of the first things that makes unification really difficult is that North Korea and South Korea now have been separate since, really since 1946, 47, 48. So we're talking about, 70 some odd years now, 80 years? It means that we've had, maybe 2 or 3 generations of people who have been born in North Korea and in South Korea that they've never really seen each other, they've never really spoken to one another. And the cultures are really diverging. Perhaps you know that some of the North Korean refugees that come south have a very difficult time adjusting socially because South Korean society is so very different from North Korean society. So I think that reunification is very hard on a social level, but it's also very, very difficult on a geopolitical level. It's my thought that while I believe that a unified Korea would be a stronger Korea in the long run, but I'm not so sure that Korea's neighbors necessarily want to see a unified Korea. I think that especially for China, that North Korea serves as a buffer state, and a divided Korea is a weaker Korea, I think. So these are some of the, and then moreover, if we're going to have unification, can you imagine South Korean government and South Korean society saying, okay, now we're going to become a communist state? Or can you imagine the North Korean government saying, okay, we give up, we'll become a capitalist society now, and we'll become a liberal democracy? Right? It's not so easy. Not so easy. So those are the kinds of problems that we have, problems that we have to overcome. So through cultural and sporting events, my feeling is that any kind of engagement is good. I am very much in favor of engagement with North Korea. And I think that the more connections there are, the more possibilities there are to overcome these kinds of differences. And the more connections there are, the more that people can interact with one another, maybe not as North Koreans and South Koreans, but to interact with each other as people, as human beings, to make those kinds of human connections. So I think that sporting events and cultural events are helpful, but I don't think by themselves that they're big enough to overcome some of the very, very serious obstacles that there are to unification. So these are good questions.
Thank you, Professor, for the answer.
You're welcome. See, Nanhao says, hi, Prof, thanks for the presentation. Is the East Asian cosmopolitan world you mentioned still relevant to the end? It seems to be China, Japan, Korea have different ways to receive Westernization. A lot of the different for. Okay, so yeah, it's definitely true that if we look at the ways in which China and Korea and Japan dealt with a kind of Western modernity, that I think each country is different. Japan is very famous, I think, for the Meiji reforms that were, especially during the 1870s and 1880s, were extremely radical. In fact, so radical that by the time you get into the 1890s, some Japanese people think they went too far. in becoming too Western. So, in 1870s Japan, there are, people are talking about like eliminating the Japanese language, and everybody's wearing, 1870s style, dresses and top hats and listening to Western music, and they all think that everything Japanese is worthless. And then the next generation comes, right, and they say, wait, we can't just throw away everything. But if we look at the Chinese model, during the final years of the Qing dynasty, then we have a self-strengthening movement that is more interested in adopting Western technologies, but maintaining, Qing institutional forms and maintaining Chinese cultural forms and intellectual forms and that sort of thing. And so that's quite different. I think that Korea really started on this path much later than, in Qing. We have the self-strengthening movement. I think we can date that back to around 1860, even before the Meiji reforms. And Meiji reforms are starting in 1860s, 1870s. Real sort of radical reform in Korea doesn't start until the middle to late 1890s. So it's a much slower, sort of later process. And I think that we see the result of that in ways that I think that Korea was not able to really withstand the onslaught of Japanese colonization. So the other question here, which I think is really interesting, is this cosmopolitan world still relevant? That's a tough one. And I'll say that I want to say generally, yes, I think actually it is still relevant. But I think what's also true now, though, is that unlike the early modern period, now we have mixed in with this kind of East Asian cosmopolitanism, we also have nationalism mixed in as well. So, I wanted to stress that in the early modern period, that when people in Joseon are reading what we might call Chinese classics, they're not reading them because they're Chinese. They're reading them because they're classics. They're reading them because it's knowledge. It's authentic knowledge. The fact that it's from China is not relevant. What's relevant is that the knowledge is authentic, real knowledge. But now, I think we're in a position where this kind of cosmopolitanism has some political problems to it. So that, for example, up until maybe the 1980s or so, Korean people used Chinese characters routinely in their writing. And actually, Chinese script has been used in Korea for 1,000 years. But now, if you write in mixed script, or you write together with Hangul and also Hanja together, some people find this to be kind of a political statement, or they find it to be politically threatening in some fashion. And so I think that in some ways, I still look to this kind of cosmopolitanism with some degree of hope. But I think, though, that there are also a lot of sort of national interests now that make this kind of cosmopolitanism a little bit more difficult to realize. I mean, I know actually that now in China, there's a lot of talk about kind of the Tianxia thought, that instead of like a Westphalian international system, that we might look to a Chinese model of international relations based upon this idea of there being a kind of a one world, a Tianxia, the all under heaven, and that relationships between states are not necessarily equal, but they might be actually unequal or hierarchical. And actually, some people have said if you look at the Ming and Qing period, from the 1300s all the way to the 1800s, how many major wars were there in East Asia? And you compare the same time period in Europe, and how many major wars were there from the 1300s to the 1800s? And some people say, the European system is unstable. The European system is far too violent, and that perhaps actually a more Chinese system might be a better way to ensure international peace and interstate relations. So some people are looking to that and saying that maybe what we need to do is to reintroduce these kinds of cosmopolitan ideas. But it's going to be difficult to try to reinstate that kind of idea when I think at this point, the marketplace of ideas is highly variable. It's not just that we're dealing with the so-called Confucian classics, but we have many bodies of knowledge now And we don't have that one kind of hegemonic intellectual world. So, as I said, still to this day, the classics sell very well in Korea. And if you go to YouTube and you look for lectures on the classics, I do this actually myself, you can find many lectures in Korean about the classics. It's still very popular. But how much that will enable us to overcome national differences, I'm not sure. In this period, it may not be that easy. That's a very good question. Thank you. Mr. Schiffer, in which way do you think reunification can start? Could be a peaceful revolution like Germany, where well, there are some really big differences between German unification and the situation with North Korea. Because during the course of a divided Germany, there was a lot of contact between people in East Germany and people in West Germany. So there's the mail still going back and forth. Sometimes people can visit. There's a lot of communication. And even though there was a lot of communication, the reunification of Germany was very difficult. And actually still, right, we haven't really totally overcome differences in economic opportunity and economic development in the former East Germany versus the former West Germany. So the situations are not totally comparable. But I'm not a North Korea specialist, but I will say, though, that I've heard a proposal for a federation. Because I don't think it's realistic to suggest that either North Korea or South Korea is just going to disappear and join the other one. So a federation might have two states together in a single federation. And so that over time, and perhaps over a very long time, that the two states might gradually come together. But at first we might have we might have something called the Korean Federation. And the Korean Federation is made up of the North Korean state and made up of the South Korean state. And we might open up the DMZ, open up travel, open up but even then, I know that even if that was to happen, the opening between North and South also would have to be very slow. I know that there is concern that if you had an instantaneous opening, that there might be a flood perhaps of North Korean refugees coming to the South. I don't know, but I think that the best hope for unification is going to be probably something fairly gradual, and that it would involve a federal model, a federation. Of course, nobody expected the sudden collapse of the Eastern European states in 1989, but North Korea, though, has constantly and repeatedly disappointed people who predicted a sudden collapse. So I think that North Korea is much stronger than many people think it might be, and that I don't imagine it's going to suddenly collapse. That's my feeling. But of course, as a historian, I should not be predicting the future, right? But that's how I think about it. Just as you're, let's see, okay. So from Hamie, I think that I'm 53 years old, and I began to study Korean about 20 years ago, and at that time was maybe just the beginning of the end of Hanja, but I knew that I wanted to be a historian, and in order to be a historian, you must read Hanja, you must read Hanmun in classical Chinese. There's no way you can do that. You can't be a scholar without it. So I studied it. And just in terms of my own personal experience, that when I traveled to Japan, or I traveled to China, I understand a great deal of what's going on. I can read things, I can navigate my way around. And also, even though I don't really have any facility in spoken Chinese or in spoken Japanese, but I've written messages to people, even now. So I've traveled in Northeast China. I was on the train traveling to Shenyang and to Chang'an, and I had conversations with people on the train, not orally, but entirely in writing. And so I do feel that even just on a personal level, that when you have a reading knowledge of Chinese, it opens up many avenues of communication that you wouldn't otherwise have. So I think that I personally find that Hanja is really important for international communication, and I also think it's really important for a deeper knowledge of Korean language. Maybe the globalization trend and the localization trend. Yeah, I mean, I think that having a reading knowledge of Hanja would be something that would be really helpful, actually, in an effort to integrate, say, Northeast Asia. I think that would be important. And you mentioned like the European Union or the European Community. That I think again that's also a possibility. But I do also believe though that in the 20th century we have a lot of unresolved historical problems. And perhaps, in Europe, I think Europeans have done a lot better at maybe overcoming kind of a 과거청산, overcoming some of the historical issues that have plagued them, although not entirely. But I think that there's still a lot of tension between Korea and Japan and between China and Japan. And I think that that's a really serious issue that's going to have to be addressed. I don't know exactly how. But I do though think that this kind of there is still perhaps a remnant of this kind of East Asian cosmopolitanism that might be a useful foundation. Thank you very much for your interest. I really like listening. Oh well, thank you. I hope that the lecture was interesting. Thank you.
네, 선생님 오늘 지금 시간이 거의 다 되어서 이제 추가적으로
I think that today's lecture is up to you. Maybe I think that if we have more questions, but because of the time constraint,
이렇게 선생님의 이메일 주소를 적어주셔도 되고.
so please write down your questions.
Q&A 창이 만들어져
And also we have a Q&A site. So please write down your questions to the Q&A site, or if you give your questions on this email address, we will ask the lecturer to give you the answer. And also this lecture will be edited, and that this lecture video clip will be open to you later. So maybe you are able to watch this video clip again.
그리고 또 저희가 또 추가적으로 하나만 더 안내를
So I have one more information. The information is about the field trip. So the October and November, you are able to choose the field trip on October and November. And I know that you already gave information about the field trip, and also we will give the email to you about the field trip. So please check the field trip and fulfill your field trip. And Joshua, Professor, thank you for your excellent presentation, and I hope that we will invite you again to have a wonderful presentation. And thank you for being here today. So the next Friday, 7 o'clock, you will join on the next presentation. Thank you. So please use this Zoom link to enjoy the next lecture. Thank you.
수고하셨습니다. 이정미 선생님 오늘 수고 많이 하셨습니다.
수고하셨습니다.
네.
네, 내일 뵙겠습니다.
네, 네.